Hey, brothers and sisters. So I wanted to talk about the Revelation 12 sign. Now, this is something that I find really interesting, and I myself wanting the rapture to happen sooner and looking for things in the Bible and things outside the Bible regarding signs that the Lord is giving us to potentially point to the rapture excites me. But one of the things that I want to be careful not to do is to take scripture out of context. And as I have been joining Rapture chat lines and High Watch Date chat lines, I've often heard people refer to the Revelation 12 sign as the rapture of the church. Now, this didn't originally sit well with me, and so I decided to do a little more research. And this video is not an attempt to make an authoritative statement on whether this is true or not, just to get people to think a little bit more within the context of how it was written, rather than imposing something into the text that might not be there. So regarding Revelation 12 sign, for many of you who don't know, I'm sure many of my subscribers do know what this is. There was a lot of publicity surrounding the Revelation 12 sign around September of 2017, which was an alignment of planets above the constellation Virgo, along with certain placements of the sun, the moon, and Jupiter, which Scotty Clark discovered and interpreted as the sign of Revelation 12:1. He also interpreted the snatching up of the male child in verse 5 as the rapture, which naturally had everybody excited. And he gave some logical arguments for why it could symbolically represent the rapture. So I want to take a look at this a little deeper and just read it within its normal context and ask the question, is this referring to the rapture at all? Now, again, as a disclaimer, I do not doubt that God can use the sun, the moon, and the stars as a sign. In fact, that's what it says in the Bible, that these things are for a sign. But is it a sign of the rapture? Because as we look at the rapture, we are looking for an imminent event, a surprise thief-like event, that we will know we are drawing closer to the rapture simply by the things stated in the tribulation. Okay, so we don't want to take verses that are applied to the tribulation and impose them on the church age. And I know how easy it is to want the rapture to happen so bad that we impose a meaning that isn't there onto the text. So, with that said, let's start with Revelation 12:1 and walk through this. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns. So let's just stop right there. We know that the red dragon is Satan, without a doubt. Okay, there's no doubt that this is Satan. 7 heads and 10 horns. So here we see the Antichrist system, because in the book in Daniel chapter 7, it talks about the 10 horns, or the 10 kingdoms, or the 10 kings, right? And on his head were 7 diadems, and his tail swept away a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, and we know this woman is Israel, who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. I think this is a reference to Herod. I think this is a reference to in Matthew, where it talks about all the male children being killed, and then Jesus, along with Mary and Joseph, fled to Egypt and was kept safe there until it was safe for Jesus to come back. This is a reference to Satan trying to annihilate the promised Messiah, okay? In verse 5, and she gave birth to a son, a male child. This is Jesus Christ. Israel gave birth to Jesus Christ, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Now, this is where the rapture interpretation gets imposed on the meaning of the scripture, because it says, well, in Revelation 2, it's talked about the church being joined with Christ. And so when it talks about this male child ruling all nations with a rod of iron, this simply can't just mean Jesus Christ in the millennial kingdom, because it says that the child was caught up. And many people say, well, this is the ascension of Christ. But it does say caught up, which is the word harpazo. So many people say, well, this is the rapture of the church. But here's where I think the problem lies. If we go on, then the woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God. So there she would be nourished for 1,260 days, which is 3.5 years. So here we see Israel giving birth to Jesus Christ, who's going to rule the nations with a rod of iron. And then it says her child is caught up to God and to his throne. So we have to figure out who that is. But then it says the woman, Israel, fled into the wilderness. Now, when does this happen, brothers and sisters? This happens at the midpoint of the tribulation period. And for those of us who believe in a pre-trib rapture, the church gets raptured before the tribulation. And this takes place at the midpoint of the tribulation. But let's go on. Verse 7. And there was war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels waged war. And they were not strong enough, and there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, he who accuses them before our God day and night, and they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony, and they did not love their life even when faced with death. So let's just stop right there. So we see a war in heaven happening, but when does this war in heaven happen? I believe this war in heaven happens at the midpoint of the tribulation period. Okay, so Satan is cast down, and then it says that he, along with him, are his demons that are cast down, because he's the one that drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. Okay, so he's essentially taking his horde with him to earth. Now listen what it says, and they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony, did not love their life even when faced with death. This has got to be the tribulation saints, because the church is already raptured before this tribulation period. For this reason, rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, knowing that he has only a short time. He only has 3.5 years. So what happens when he realizes that he only has 3.5 years? Well, it says in verse 13, when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman, Israel, who gave birth to the male child, Jesus Christ. But the 2 wings of the great eagle were given to Israel, the woman, so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place where she was nourished for a time, a times and a half a time, from the presence of the serpent. So here we see Israel being kept safe in the wilderness, in the rock of Petra for 3.5 years until Jesus Christ returns. And the serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, so that he might cause her to be swept away with the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and drank up the river which the dragon poured out of his mouth. So the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her children, who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. This is obviously the remnant Gentile tribulation saint believers. So he couldn't get to Israel because the third of Israel, which Zechariah talks about, a third of it will be saved when they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven. The rest of those people are the tribulation saints, and that's who the dragon goes after for the last 3.5 years, in which we see mass martyrdom. But the question we have to get back to is, we know that this all kind of kicks off the war in heaven. The Revelation 12 sign really kicks off at the midpoint of the tribulation. So how does a rapture, a child being caught up to heaven and his throne, how does this fit into this timeline? Okay? Are we simply looking at verse 5 being Israel giving birth to Jesus Christ, and then Jesus Christ gives birth to us, the church, and then we are caught up to God into his throne, and then it fast forwards to during the tribulation period at the midpoint, where we see the abomination of desolation, and then we see Satan entering the Antichrist, and then we see the Antichrist going after Israel, and then because the Antichrist can't get after Israel, it goes after the tribulation saints. I would think, just thinking out loud, this would be a natural progression of the text. But for some reason, I have a problem imposing the church into the child that was caught up, because it distinctly tells us, brothers and sisters, in verse 5, that this child is Jesus Christ and that he will rule the nations with a rod of iron. And it never says of the church that Satan was ready to devour the church. It says the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. So we have that promise that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church, and that greater is he that is in us than he that is of this world, and that we are promised to be more than overcomers. So the church, I think, cannot be the male child. It has to be Jesus Christ. But the question I have for you, brothers and sisters, is what does it mean when the child was caught up to God and to his throne? Does this mean, well, we have three options. Is this Jesus Christ being supernaturally protected when he was a baby? Is this the church being caught up before the tribulation period? Or is this Christ's ascension? And that is the question, brothers and sisters, that I pose to you today. Again, this is not an absolute statement. This is thinking out loud and trying to glean from the scriptures what in context this scripture is talking about. So I pray that you guys can leave your comments and give me your thoughts.